She counted the coins 3 times before she believed it, and the third count was no kinder than the first. $3. Not $3 and something, $3, flat, cold, final. The last of what her husband's name was worth in this valley, now that his name was all she had left of him. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the yard like a whip before she'd even lifted her hand. "Pen 41, he called, and didn't wait for anyone to look. Nobody looked. That was the thing about Pen 41. The valley had already decided what it was worth, and what it was worth was nothing. And nothing doesn't need looking at. She looked anyway. 37 goats pressed into a pen built for a third that many, ribs like fence rails under matted hide, a wet cough moving through them one to the next like gossip through a church pew. Somebody's culled stock, sold off before winter feed ran short, priced to disappear before dark. The auctioneer wasn't even trying. He named $1 and let it sit, and when nobody stirred, he names $2. And when nobody stirred at $2 either, he looked ready to just give the whole pen to whoever'd haul it off his ledger for free. That was when she raised her hand. $3, she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything else in her wanted to. The auctioneer laughed before he caught himself, not cruel, just surprised. The laugh of a man who'd forgotten a woman in a faded blue dress was still standing at the rail. $3, he repeated, like the words themselves were the joke, like he was handing the punchline back to the crowd to make sure they hadn't missed it. A few men near the fence chuckled along with him. One spat into the dust and said something about a fool and her money not staying together long. And the men near him laughed harder, because it was market day, and the day needed a joke, and she had just handed them one for free, same as the goats. She kept her hand up. $3, going once, the auctioneer said, still grinning, waiting for someone, anyone, to save her from herself with a raised hand and a better bid. Nobody raised a hand. Why would they? The pen was coughing sickness into the autumn air, and every rancher within 20 miles could smell it from where he stood. Going twice. She did not blink. She did not look at the men laughing. She looked at the goats, at the way one doe near the rail had turned her head toward the sound of a human voice, like she was still hoping, after everything, that a voice might mean something kind. "Sold," the auctioneer said, "to the widow for $3. And the way he said widow made it sound like a diagnosis, and the laughter rose up around her like water closing over a stone. And she stood in the middle of it with her chin level and her hand finally coming down. And underneath the noise, underneath the $3 and the 37 goats, and the whole valley's certainty that she had just thrown away the last of what she owned, underneath all of it, something in her had already started counting differently than they were. That's where this story begins. Not with luck, not with a stranger's kindness or a hidden fortune under the floorboards. With $3, 37 goats nobody wanted, and a woman the valley had already finished judging. Stay with me a while. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I like to know how far a quiet story like this one travels. Now, let's go back to the morning before the auction, before the $3, before any of it. Because to understand what she saw in that pen, you have to understand what she'd already lost. Her name was Naomi Pruitt, and 11 months before that auction, she had been a rancher's wife with 400 acres under her husband's name, and a house with real glass in the windows. 11 months before that, her husband Thomas had ridden out after a storm to bring in cattle scattered along the creek bottom, and the creek had taken the horse out from under him. And by the time they found him, the water had already decided how the story of Thomas Pruitt was going to end. What the valley didn't know, what only Naomi and a lawyer in the county seat knew, was that Thomas had mortgaged the 400 acres 2 years before he died, gambling on a cattle contract that fell through when the buyer went bankrupt in Kansas City. The bank held paper on land that had never once been hers to lose, and 6 months after the funeral, it wasn't. She'd moved into a 2-room cabin on the edge of what used to be her own property, land too rocky and too far from water for the bank to bother reclaiming, land nobody had wanted, even when Thomas was alive, to farm it. 11 acres, a well that ran low by August, and a roof that needed more attention than she had time to give it. The Valley had opinions about all of this, and the Valley shared them freely, the way people do about a woman who no longer has a husband to make her respectable by association. Some pitied her, which was its own kind of insult. Some said she should have remarried by now, 6 months a widow being plenty long enough. A few, and these were the ones whose voices carried furthest at the mercantile and the church socials, said she'd married above herself in the first place, and this was simply the world correcting an error. Naomi heard all of it. She answered none of it. She had learned, in the year since Thomas drowned, that arguing with a verdict only proves you care what the jury thinks. What she did instead was watch. She watched the way water moved through the valley in spring and pooled in low places nobody farmed. She watched which weeds grew thick in soil everyone called ruined, and which grew thin, because weeds don't lie about what's underneath them. She watched 3 days before the fall auction, when a rancher named Hollis Greer drove 37 goats into town to unload before winter feed costs ate what little profit was left in keeping them. She knew Hollis Greer's goats. Everyone did. He'd bought them cheap from a Missouri man 2 summers back, a mixed lot with some Toggenburg blood in them, decent milkers in their day, before Greer's hired man let a barn flood and half the herd came down with hoof rot and the kind of wet cough that spreads through a crowded pen like a rumor. Greer wanted them gone. He didn't want to treat 37 sick goats through a Kansas winter for a return that might not cover the grain. He wanted the auction to do what auctions do: turn a problem into somebody else's problem, cheap, before dark. Naomi had grown up 40 miles east, on a smaller place than the one she'd married into, where her mother had kept goats the old way, the way her grandmother had taught her, back before dairy cattle made goat milk seem like a poor family's substitute rather than what it actually was. A food that traveled better, digested easier, and could turn low ground and rough browse into something worth eating. Her mother had made cheese every week of Naomi's childhood, soft cheese wrapped in cloth and hung to drain in the cellar, hard cheese aged on shelves down where the earth kept its own cool weather, no matter the season above. Naomi hadn't touched a cheesecloth in 11 years. She hadn't needed to. Thomas's cattle money had bought cheese, same as anything else, back when there was cattle money. But she remembered. She remembered the smell of warm milk and rennet, the particular patience the curd demanded, the way her mother's hands moved through the process like they were following a hymn they'd sung 1,000 times. She remembered that a sick goat wasn't a dead goat, that hoof rot cleared with dry ground and attention, that a cough could pass through a crowded pen and pass right back out again once the animals had room to breathe and feed that wasn't moldy from Greer's flooded barn. She remembered that nobody in this valley made cheese anymore. Not real cheese, not aged cheese, not anything beyond the soft curds a few farm wives set out for their own tables. The nearest hard cheese came up from Kansas City on the supply wagons, expensive, often gone rubbery by the time it arrived, and every mercantile owner in 3 counties would have bought local cheese at a fair price if any local had bothered making it worth buying. So, When Hollis Greer's 37 goats stood coughing in pen 41 on auction day, and the whole valley saw 37 sick animals worth less than the rope holding the gate shut, Naomi Pruitt saw 37 mothers, most of them still able to milk, all of them recovering from a sickness that dry ground and clean feed would cure inside a month. She saw a cellar under her rocky little cabin that stayed cool and even-tempered, no matter what the Kansas sky was doing above it. She saw $3 as the cheapest tuition she was ever going to get in a trade her own mother had already taught her for free, years before anybody thought she'd need it again. And she saw, though she would not have said this part out loud to a living soul, a chance to stop being the Valley's cautionary tale and start being something the Valley would have to reckon with on its own terms. $3, 37 goats. They laughed for a week. The walk home from the auction was 4 miles, and Naomi made it driving 37 goats ahead of her with a hazel switch she never once raised to strike anything, only to guide. It took most of the afternoon. The goats were weak and slow and stopped often, and twice she had to double back for stragglers who'd folded their legs under themselves in the dust and simply refused to go another step until she'd coaxed them up with a hand on the flank and a low voice that promised, without any words at all, that wherever she was taking them was better than where they'd been. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, she had them penned in the old cattle shed behind her cabin, a structure Thomas's foreclosure hadn't bothered to include because it was falling down at one corner and worth less to a bank than the paper it'd take to list it. She'd patched that corner herself over the past year, with scrap lumber and more nails than the job strictly required, because a woman living alone learns to overbuild the things she can't afford to have fail twice. She stood at the fence in the dark and listened to 37 goats cough and shuffle and settle, and she thought, not for the first time since Thomas died, that grief and work occupy the same room in a person, and when the work is honest enough, it can crowd the grief into a corner and hold it there long enough to get through the night. Word of the sale had already beaten her home. That was how the Valley worked. Faster than any letter, a piece of gossip could cross 4 miles on foot, while the person it concerned was still walking the same distance with a switch in her hand and goats ahead of her. By the time she carried water down from the well the next morning, her nearest neighbor, a widower named Ezra Coates, who farmed the section adjoining hers, was leaning on her fence rail with his hat pushed back, looking at the shed like it might explain itself. "Heard you bought Greer's sick lot," he said. "I did." $3. "That's right." Ezra Coates was somewhere past 60, gray in the beard and slow in his speech, the kind of man who said little and meant most of it. He'd known Thomas. He'd known Naomi since she came to the Valley as a bride, and in the 11 months since the funeral, he'd been one of the few who hadn't offered her pity dressed up as concern. He looked at the goats a long moment. "Greer's barn flooded in June," he said. "Half these are hoof-rotted. Rest have got that cough that goes around crowded stock." "I know." "Dry ground clears the rot. Cough'll pass if they've got room and feed that isn't moldy." "I know that too." He looked at her then, not at the goats. "You milking these or eating them?" "Milking," she said. "There's cheese in a goat that nobody around here remembers how to make. My mother made it. I watched her do it 100 times before I was old enough to help." Ezra Coates was quiet a moment longer. Then he said the word that would, over the coming months, become the closest thing to a blessing she'd receive from anyone in the Valley. "Huh." It wasn't much. It also wasn't laughter, and after the auction yard, that alone felt like standing on solid ground for the first time in a week. "I've got a spare bag of oats going stale in my crib," he said. "No use to me, my horses won't touch old oats. You want it, it's yours before it goes to nothing."
She almost said no. Pride is a reflex before it's a choice, and a year of being pitied had sharpened that reflex in her until it fired before she could think past it. But she looked at the goats, thin-flanked and coughing, and she thought about what dry feed and a little grain could do for animals recovering from a wet barn, and she swallowed the reflex. "I'd be obliged," she said. He nodded once, like that settled a matter that hadn't needed 30 words to settle, and he went to fetch the oats. And that was the first quiet conversion in a story that would need a great many more before it was through. The next weeks were not romantic. Nothing about nursing 37 sick goats back to health is romantic, and Naomi never once mistook it for anything but labor. She mucked the shed twice daily because wet bedding was the enemy of hoof rot, and hoof rot was the enemy of everything else she had planned. She separated the worst of the coughing animals from the rest, not out of medical certainty, but out of her mother's old instinct that sickness traveled faster through a crowd than a scattered few. And whether that was science or superstition, it worked well enough that within 2 weeks, the cough had thinned from a chorus to an occasional straggler. She trimmed hooves with a knife sharpened on a stone, one animal at a time, working the rot out of the cleft and packing it with a paste of lime and lard her mother had sworn by. And if her back ached and her hands cracked and bled at the knuckles from the cold mornings, she told no one, because there was no one close enough to tell who wouldn't have used it as more evidence that she'd taken on more than a woman alone should carry. By the end of the first month, 4 goats had died. Old ones, weak from the start, ones no amount of dry ground was going to save, and 33 remained. And of those 33, better than half were walking sound and coughing rarely, and beginning in the mornings to look at her the way the doe at the auction rail had looked at her, like a voice might mean something kind after all. That's not luck. That's not charity. That's work. And work has a way of showing its accounting whether anyone's watching the ledger or not. By the second month, she had milk. Not much at first. Goats recovering from illness and poor feed don't produce like goats in their prime. And the first pail she carried down to her cellar held barely 2 quarts, warm and faintly sweet, and smelling of the clover she'd been cutting for them along the creek bottom. She stood over that pail a long moment before she did anything else with it, because 2 quarts of milk from animals she'd been mocked for buying felt, in that moment, like the first coin dropped onto a scale that had been empty for a year. She made cheese the way her mother had taught her, which is to say, she made it patiently, and she made it wrong twice before she made it right. The first batch curdled too fast in a kitchen too warm, and she poured it out to the chickens rather than serve herself a lesson in failure twice over in the same week. The second batch she pressed before the whey had properly drained, and it came out crumbly and sour. Edible, but nothing she'd have paid money for herself. The third time, she slowed down. She warmed the milk gentler, added the rennet at the temperature her mother always tested with the inside of her wrist rather than any thermometer. And when the curd set, she cut it slow, into cubes no bigger than dice, and she let it sit, and she let it drain in cloth hung from a nail in her cellar ceiling, and she did not touch it again for 2 full days. What came out of that cloth was soft and clean-tasting and faintly tangy, nothing like the rubbery cheese that came up on the supply wagons from Kansas City. And she stood in her cellar with a knife and a small wedge of it and cut a sliver and put it on her tongue and closed her eyes. It tasted like her mother's kitchen. It tasted like a version of her own life she'd thought the creek had taken along with Thomas. And more than either of those things, it tasted like proof that the things she'd seen in that coughing, ribby pen of goats had been real, that her eye hadn't failed her the way the valley assumed it must have, that $3 had bought exactly what she thought it would buy. She did not cry. She had promised herself, the day she moved into the two-room cabin, that she would save her tears for private hours after dark. And this was daylight, and there was more milk warming on the stove that needed tending, before it cooled past the temperature the rennet wanted. But she stood there a long moment with her eyes shut, and let herself feel, just once, just for the length of that sliver of cheese dissolving on her tongue, that she had not been wrong. Ezra Coates was the first person outside her own kitchen to taste it, 3 weeks later, when he came by with another sack of stale oats and stood at her fence the way he always did, hat pushed back, saying little. She brought a small round of the cheese out on a plate, still soft, aged only a handful of days, and set it on the fence rail between them without much ceremony. "Made from Greer's goats," she said. He looked at it a moment, the way he'd looked at the shed the day the goats arrived. Then he cut a piece with his pocket knife and ate it, and he chewed slower than the size of the bite required, and Naomi found she was holding her breath, waiting on his verdict, same as she'd once waited on a doctor's verdict about Thomas's chances, which was a foolish comparison to make about a piece of cheese, and she knew it, and made it anyway. "Huh," Ezra said. Then, after a moment longer, "That's better than what comes up from the city." It was, she would later say, the finest compliment of her life up to that point, delivered in 4 words by a man who did not waste them. If you're finding a quiet minute in your evening for this story, I'm glad of the company. Let's keep going. Because the valley wasn't done laughing yet, and the man who'd sold her those goats in the first place was about to notice that his joke hadn't stayed dead. Hollis Greer heard about the cheese before he tasted it, which was how Hollis Greer heard about most things, through the mercantile, through the church steps, through the particular grapevine that ran fastest in a valley with not much else to talk about. He heard that the widow Pruitt was making something out of his culled goats, and his first reaction, by all accounts, was to laugh again, the same laugh he'd shared with the crowd at auction, because it seemed to him like the same joke continuing a few weeks further along. Greer was not a cruel man, by his own accounting, only a practical one, and practical men in that valley had long since decided that Naomi Pruitt's continued presence on 11 rocky acres was a temporary condition the winter would likely correct. He'd sold his sick goats at auction because keeping them through a Kansas winter made no economic sense, and the fact that someone else had bought them for pocket change and was now, apparently, making cheese out of the venture struck him as amusing rather than alarming. Cheese was a farm wife's hobby. It did not compete with cattle, with grain, with the things that actually moved money through a valley like this one. He might have gone on thinking that indefinitely if the mercantile owner, a careful man named Fenwick, who kept the only general store within 8 miles, hadn't mentioned to him one afternoon that the widow Pruitt had come in asking what he'd pay for hard cheese, aged by the wheel, come spring. "Told her I'd take some on consignment," Fenwick said. "Folks are always asking after cheese that isn't rubber by the time it gets here. If hers is any good, I'll sell it same as anything else." Greer had laughed at that too, though a little less easily than before. What Greer didn't know, what almost nobody in the valley knew yet, because Naomi kept her own counsel and her cellar doors shut, was that she had begun aging a portion of every batch rather than selling it all soft. Her mother had taught her the long method too, though Naomi had used it far less than the quick, soft cheese growing up. Because aged cheese demanded a cool, steady cellar, and months of patience most farm kitchens couldn't spare. But Naomi's cellar, dug into the rocky rise behind her cabin, held a temperature so even through summer and winter alike that her mother would have called it a gift from God. And Naomi, more practically, called it the one asset the bank hadn't thought worth taking. She wrapped the wheels in cloth soaked in brine, turned them by hand every few days, brushed away the molds that bloomed and re-bloomed on the rind, and waited the way the process demanded, which is to say, with more patience than most people in that valley had ever seen a woman her age exercise over anything. Meanwhile, the herd grew stronger. By late winter, 33 goats had become 39, 3 does having kidded through the cold months, and Naomi found herself, for the first time in a year, waking before dawn not from grief, but from the ordinary urgency of animals that needed milking. There is a particular mercy in work that must be done regardless of how a person feels about doing it. Grief asks permission to consume a whole day. A goat in milk does not. She sold what soft cheese she could through Fenwick's Mercantile that winter. Small amounts, a few coins at a time, enough to buy grain and patch a second corner of the shed roof and keep herself in flour and coffee. It was not wealth. It was something better suited to her purposes just then, which was proof. Proof delivered weekly in small transactions at a store counter that what she was building was not a fantasy she'd talked herself into at an auction rail, but a business, however small, with real coins changing real hands because of it. The valley noticed, the way the valley noticed everything, in pieces and murmurs long before anyone said it to her face. A few of the churchwomen who'd once offered pity now offered a different kind of attention. The careful, sideways attention people give something they haven't decided yet whether to admire or resent. One of them, a woman named Delphine Ashworth, who ran the loudest opinions in the county and had been among the first to call Naomi's $3 bid a fool's purchase, was heard to remark at a social that some cheese had come from somewhere or other, and that she supposed it was fine if you liked that sort of thing. It was, Naomi thought when she heard about it secondhand, the closest thing to an apology Delphine Ashworth was constitutionally capable of offering, and she let it stand without comment, because answering scorn with scorn only feeds the thing you're trying to starve. Spring came hard that year. A late frost in April that killed the first tender growth along the creek bottom and put every rancher in the valley on edge about what kind of summer was coming behind it. Naomi lost 2 kids to the cold snap, born too early and too weak to survive a night that dropped near freezing after weeks of warmth had fooled everyone, herself included, into complacency. She buried them behind the shed in the gray hour before the sun came up properly, and she allowed herself, that morning and that morning only, the tears she'd been saving. Then she went back to the milking, because 37 goats, 39 minus the 2, required her hands whether her heart was in them that day or not, and there is a mercy in that, too, the same mercy that had gotten her through the year since Thomas died. Work does not ask how you feel. It only asks that you show up. By June, the aged wheels in her cellar had turned from young and mild to something sharper, nuttier, the rind gone properly hard and gray gold, and Naomi cut into one of them alone one evening to test what 4 months of patience had bought her. She had made cheese before in her life. She had never, until that night, made cheese that tasted like this, dense, complex, carrying a flavor of the clover and wild herbs her goats had browsed along the creek, aged into something that reminded her, faintly and strangely, of the good cheeses that occasionally arrived from back east at Christmas, the kind Thomas used to buy her as a treat in the early good years of their marriage, before the mortgage and the cattle contract and the flood that took him. She sat at her kitchen table with that cheese and a lamp burning low, and she thought, this is worth something. Not soft cheese, sell it quiet through Fenwick's counter worth something, actually worth something. The kind of worth that gets talked about past the edges of one valley. And for the first time since the auction, she let herself imagine what happened next, instead of simply enduring her way toward it. Fenwick tasted the aged cheese in early July, and Fenwick, who had spent 30 years pricing goods for a living and had developed, in that time, an honest nose for what would sell and what wouldn't, went very quiet after his first bite. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, "how much of this do you have?" 11 wheels, aging," she said, "more coming behind them." He named a price for the wheel in front of him that made her sit very still for a moment to be sure she'd heard him correctly. It was more than double what she'd been getting for the soft cheese, wheel for wheel, and Fenwick, a careful man, not given to generosity for its own sake, told her plainly that he intended to sell it not at his regular counter, but set apart, labeled, at a price that reflected what it actually was. "Cheese like this doesn't come through this valley," he said. "Not since I've kept this store. Folks'll pay for it. I intend to see they get the chance." Word moved the way word always moved in that country, faster than any single person could carry it, and within 2 weeks a rider had come down from the county seat asking after the widow's cheese on the recommendation of a traveling grain buyer who'd tasted a wedge at Fenwick's counter and hadn't stopped talking about it the whole way to his next stop. Within a month, a request had come from a hotel dining room 2 towns over, wanting to know if the supply could be made regular, and at what quantity, and whether Mrs. Pruitt might consider a standing arrangement. Naomi answered every inquiry the same way she'd answered the auctioneer 11 months before, steady, unshaken, no more words than the situation required. Yes, she could supply cheese regularly. Yes, quantities would grow as her herd grew. No, she would not lower her price to match what rubbery cheese cost coming up from Kansas City, because her cheese was not that, and everyone who'd tasted it already knew as much. It was the county fair, held the second week of August that year in the seat town, that finally turned private word into public reckoning. And it happened in a way Naomi could not have staged if she'd tried. The fair had a category, as most such fairs did, for dairy products, and Fenwick, without asking her permission, which she forgave him for entirely once she understood his reasoning, had entered 3 wheels of her aged cheese under her name before she'd even decided whether to attend the fair at all. She went, in the end, mostly because Ezra Coates told her plainly that a woman who'd worked as hard as she had owed it to herself to stand in the same room as the judgment, whichever way it fell, rather than hide from it at home. He drove her in his wagon, the 2 of them saying little on the road, the way they generally said little to each other, comfortable in the silence 2 people share when neither feels obligated to fill it. The dairy tent that afternoon was crowded in a way Naomi hadn't anticipated. Farm wives with their butter and buttermilk, ranchers with cow's milk cheese from herds 20 times the size of hers, and, in among them, unremarkable on the judging table until someone actually cut into it, 3 plain gray-gold wheels bearing a card that read simply, N. Pruitt. The judge that year was a man brought in from the State Agricultural College, a stranger to the valley, and therefore, crucially, a stranger to its opinions about who Naomi Pruitt was, and what a $3 auction bid had supposedly proven about her judgment. He went down the table methodically, tasting, making notes, saying little, and when he reached her wheel, he did something the crowd noticed before Naomi herself fully registered it. He stopped. He cut a second sliver. He tasted it slower than the first, the way Ezra had once tasted her cheese at the fence rail, and he looked up and asked, to no one in particular, whose cheese this was. "Mine," Naomi said, stepping forward from where she'd been standing near the tent flap, and the crowd, a good portion of the valley, gathered in one canvas tent on a hot August afternoon, turned to look at her the way they'd looked at her exactly once before, at the auction rail 11 months earlier, except this time the look carried none of the laughter it had carried then. "This is remarkable work," the judge said, plainly, professionally, without any notion that he was handing her something she'd waited nearly a year to hear from anyone in this valley. "Where do you source your milk?" "My own herd," she said. 39 goats, off Hollis Greer's culled lot from last fall's auction. A murmur went through the tent at that, the specific kind of murmur that happens when a room full of people realizes, all together and all at once, that a story they thought they understood has an ending they didn't see coming. Hollis Greer himself was somewhere in that crowd, and though Naomi never learned exactly what his face did in that moment, Ezra told her afterward that it was worth the price of admission on its own, and left it at that, in the way Ezra left most things. The judge awarded her cheese the top ribbon in the aged category, and mentioned, in the brief remarks fair judges are given the latitude to make, that he had eaten cheese in 3 states and rarely encountered a home producer working at this level of skill. She stood in that tent with a blue ribbon in her hand and 39 now, goats worth of vindication finally spoken aloud in front of the very people who'd laughed her into silence at that auction rail. And she did not gloat. She did not look for Greer's face in the crowd to see how it had fallen. She simply said, "Thank you," plainly, the way she said most things, and stepped back so the judge could move to the next table, because there were other entries still waiting on his verdict, and she had never been a woman who needed the whole room's attention to know what she'd accomplished. But that evening, riding home in Ezra Coates's wagon with the blue ribbon folded carefully into her apron pocket, she let herself feel it, the particular, quiet, unshowy triumph of a thing proven true after a year of being told it couldn't be. The fair ribbon did what fair ribbons do in small counties, which is travel faster and further than any single conversation could carry it. Within a week, the hotel 2 towns over had its standing order confirmed and doubled. Within 2 weeks, a buyer from a larger mercantile in the county seat itself had ridden out to Naomi's rocky little farm to see the operation firsthand, and had stood in her cellar a long while, running his hand along the aging shelves, asking questions about her methods that she answered plainly and without giving away every secret her mother had ever taught her. By the end of August, riders were coming from 3 counties over, not a figure of speech, but a literal accounting, since Naomi began, out of the same instinct that had once counted her last coins 3 times over, to note in a ledger where each customer traveled from. Prairie County, Ashford County, Millbrook County. Men on horseback and wagons alike, coming to the same rocky 11 acres the bank hadn't wanted, the same little cabin the valley had once assumed would sit empty by the following spring, now with a line of customers some mornings waiting at her gate before she'd finished the first milking. Fenwick raised her price twice more before the year was out, each time at her own insistence rather than his, because she'd learned enough by then to know what her cheese was worth, even when the man selling it might have been content to keep the margin comfortable for himself. She did not gouge anyone. She simply refused, ever again, to let anyone else's convenience price her labor. Hollis Greer came to her gate himself in September, which surprised her more than the buyers and the riders and the standing orders combined. He stood at the fence the way Ezra always stood at the fence, hat in his hands rather than pushed back on his head. And he did not apologize outright, because men like Greer rarely apologize outright. But he asked plainly whether she'd consider buying his spring kids the following year at a fair price, rather than his selling them off cheap to whoever'd take them. "You'd know what to do with them better than anybody else who'd bid," he said. "Better than I ever did, raising them." It was, Naomi understood, as close to an apology as the man was built to give, and she accepted it in the same spirit Ezra's 4-word compliment had come in, plainly, without making him say more than he was able to say. "I'll look at what you've got in spring," she said. "I pay a fair price, not a favor price. "Wouldn't ask for a favor price," he said, and something in his voice suggested he understood, finally, that he never should have offered her one in the first place either. Not that day at the auction. Not in the years since.
Delphine Ashworth, for her part, never offered an apology of any kind, being constitutionally unable to admit an error in judgment, even when the evidence stood ribboned and reputable in front of the entire county. But she did, come the harvest fair the following month, purchase 2 full wheels of Naomi's aged cheese for her own table, paid in full coin, no discount requested, and served them at her own gathering as though she'd always known the widow Pruitt had it in her. Naomi heard about that transaction the way she heard about most Valley gossip now, secondhand, over the mercantile counter, from Fenwick, who told her with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a long story arrive exactly where it was always going to land. She laughed, quietly, when she heard it. Not the laugh the auction crowd had aimed at her 11 months before. A different laugh entirely, private and warm. The kind a person allows themselves when the joke has finally, fully, turned all the way around. We're most of the way there now. Let me tell you how the winter after that harvest looked different from the one before it, because that's really where this story keeps its meaning. By the time the first snow came that year, Naomi Pruitt's cellar held 41 wheels of aging cheese. Her herd had grown to 52 goats through careful breeding and the purchase of 6 more from Greer's spring kidding at the fair price she'd insisted on. And her ledger, the same battered book she'd started keeping the week after the auction, tracking every coin against every expense with the same fierce attention she'd once given the 3 coins she'd counted 3 times over, showed a season's profit that would have seemed like a fantasy to the woman standing at that auction rail a year before. She had patched the last corner of the shed roof properly that autumn, with new lumber bought and paid for, rather than scrap salvaged from wherever she could find it. She had bought a second lamp for the cellar, so she could work the wheels by better light on the short winter days. She had, in October, paid off the small debt she'd carried at Fenwick's store all through that first hard year. And Fenwick had waved off her thanks the way a man does when he already knows he's about to make far more money selling her cheese than he ever made carrying her flour and coffee on credit. She had not, in any of it, forgotten what the year had cost her to build. She thought of Thomas often, especially in the quiet hour after the evening milking, when the goats had settled and the cellar door was shut on another day's work, and she found that the grief, while it had never entirely left the room the way she'd once hoped it would, had learned to share the space with something else now. Pride, maybe, or simple steadiness, the particular peace of a person who has proven something true to herself that no one else's opinion could have proven for her. She thought, too, of the auctioneer, and the way he'd said the widow like a diagnosis, and she found she could think of it now without the old flinch, because a diagnosis, it turned out, was not a sentence. It was only ever the Valley's first guess, and the Valley, like most crowds standing at a fence rail laughing at what they didn't understand, had guessed wrong. Ezra Coates came by most evenings that winter, same as he'd always come by, hat pushed back, saying little, and if something warmer had begun growing between the two of them in the months since he'd first offered her a sack of stale oats, something neither of them rushed to name, both having learned patience the hard way in their own separate griefs. It grew the way everything worthwhile in that valley grew that year. Slowly, honestly, proven by steady presence, rather than declared by any speech neither of them was inclined to make. "You did it," he said to her one evening in December, standing at the cellar door while she turned the last of the day's wheels. "Did what?" she said, though she knew. "What you set out to do, back at that auction. Everybody laughed. You did it anyway." She considered that a moment, cloth in her cracked and lie-stung hands, the smell of aging cheese thick in the cold cellar air around them. "I didn't set out to prove anybody wrong," she said finally. "I set out to feed myself through a winter. Everything past that was just the work doing what work does, if you let it." Ezra made a sound that wasn't quite his usual, something softer, and he didn't say anything more, and neither did she. And that was enough, the way it had always been enough between the two of them. That's the truth of it. If there's a single truth this story was ever trying to hand you, Naomi Pruitt did not win because the Valley finally decided to be kind to her. The Valley never apologized in any meaningful way, not really. Delphine Ashworth bought her cheese without ever once admitting she'd been wrong to laugh. Hollis Greer came to her gate hat in hand, but never used the word sorry outright. The auctioneer likely never thought of her again at all once the joke stopped being funny to tell. The Valley didn't change its mind about her out of grace. It changed its mind because the cheese in its cellar was real, and the coin in Fenwick's register was real, and the blue ribbon on the judging table was real. And reality, given enough patient months, has a way of correcting even the loudest room's first guess. She had 37 goats, now 52, that the whole county had once called worthless, standing in a pen behind a shed on 11 rocky acres nobody had wanted enough to take from her, even when they took everything else. She had $3 that had turned, inside of one hard year, into something that fed her, sheltered her, and answered every laugh at that auction rail without her ever once needing to raise her own voice to do it. If you take one thing from tonight's hour with Naomi Pruitt and her coughing pen of goats, let it be this. The world will often price you the way it priced her at that rail. Cheap, dismissed, sold off before dark because nobody wanted to spend the effort looking closer. That price is not the truth of you. It is only ever the first guess of people who didn't take the time to see what you saw. Worth is not a number somebody else assigns you at auction. It is proven, slowly, in the work nobody was watching you do, and it is paid out, eventually, in a currency louder than any laughter. In a cellar full of wheels aging in the dark, in a ledger that finally balances, in a valley that comes riding to your gate not because it forgives you, but because it finally has no choice left but to believe its own eyes. Don't let anyone's arithmetic talk you out of what you already know is true. The greatest things are usually closer than we think, waiting in a pen nobody else wanted to look into. Scorn is loud, and it costs the ones shouting it nothing at all. But a harvest only has to speak once, and it feeds you through every winter after. Wherever you're watching this from tonight, I hope you carry a little of Naomi Pruitt's quiet stubbornness with you into whatever pen of coughing, unwanted, overlooked things you've been told to walk past. Look closer. The Valley is not always right about what it laughs at. Good night, and may your own harvest, whenever it comes, be worth every dollar it cost you to wait for it.